On the 9th of August 1945, America bombed the Japanese city of Nagasaki with a nuclear bomb. It was one of the most consequential events, not just in World War II, but in human history. But lost in that cataclysmic event was something else that happened on that same day. Post-midnight on the 9th of August 1945, the then Soviet Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, informed the Japanese ambassador, Naotake Sato, that the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan. For the next 3 months, the Soviet Union pulverized Japan and Japanese territories. It came to be known as the Battle of Manchuria. It extended all the way from Mongolia to northeast China to the Korean Peninsula. And in early September of 1945, the Japanese Imperial Army surrendered, bringing an end to World War II. Today, 75 years later, Russia and Japan find themselves on the opposite ends of war. On Crux Decode this week, why Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine has spooked countries in Asia, from Japan to South Korea. The swiftest and sharpest reaction in Asia to Russia's military operation in Ukraine has come from Japan. Japan has frozen Russia's central bank assets. That's about 10% of Russia's total currency reserves. That is almost $60 billion. That is not a small amount. Not just that, it's also joined the West in cutting off Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system. Now, this basically means that Russian companies are going to find it incredibly difficult to do business, not just in Japan, but outside of Russia's borders anywhere in the West. So the question then is, what is driving Japan's rather hawkish response to Russia's moves in Ukraine? Now remember, Japan has territorial disputes with Russia. It's lasted for the last 6 decades, since the end of the Second World War. It's basically over 4 volcanic islands known as the South Kuril Islands in Russia, or the Northern Territories as the Japanese refer to them. The islands are situated between Hokkaido and the Russian Kamchatka Peninsula. Russia occupies the islands. It was occupied at the end of the Battle for Manchuria at the end of World War II, and it continues to this day. But Japan claims it is the original owner of these islands. The dispute over these islands has in fact prevented Japan and Russia from ever formally signing a peace treaty to end World War II. Now recently, Russia's defense ministry confirmed that it had conducted a missile drill very close to these disputed islands, and that too in the middle of this military operation in Ukraine. Now, because of its invasion in Ukraine, a large portion of Russia's military forces who were stationed on these islands had to be diverted to Eastern Europe. The Japanese government in turn lodged a protest through diplomatic channels. But there is a more fundamental debate that is going on in Japan right now, whether or not to change its pacifist constitution. Now, since the end of World War II, Japan's emphasis has been on preventing the emergence of another military regime in that country. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution says that the Japanese people will forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. It also goes on to say that the use of force as a means of settling international disputes is prohibited, and to this end, land, sea, and air forces will never be maintained, which basically means that Japan's armed forces are only meant for one purpose, and that is self-defense. Now, many in Japan are saying that this constitution was meant for post-war Japan, for that country to be accepted back into the international community. Much like Germany, Japan too had to be seen to be atoning for its sins. But in modern Japan, many are questioning whether the pacifist nature of the constitution itself needs to change, whether Article 9 needs to be amended. Japan's response to the Russian invasion stands in sharp contrast to how they responded in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. At that time, Tokyo had just imposed symbolic sanctions. In fact, the Japanese public's response too, back in 2014, was very muted. Many felt that Crimea was a very distant issue, it did not affect ordinary Japanese. But this time, many Japanese feel that Putin needs to be stopped. Else, he could end up teaming up with China and thereby pose a long-term threat to Japan. And if that were to happen, if Moscow and Beijing were to come together in some form of military alliance to confront Japan, that would be a nightmare scenario for Japan. But it's not just Japan. South Korea, too, has been responding very aggressively. For one, Russia's actions seem to have emboldened the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Over the last month or so, there have been multiple reports of North Korea testing a ballistic missile. It's happened on more than one occasion just since the launch of this war. Vladimir Putin's actions and the lack of bite in the response of the West seems to have emboldened Kim Jong-un to flex his muscles more with missile tests. Now this poses a grave challenge for the incoming conservative president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol. Basically, Mr. Yeol has to deter the North Koreans from freely testing missiles because Pyongyang knows there won't be too many consequences from the UN Security Council. Also, North Korea will be reassured by the fact that Big Brother China will always be looking out for Pyongyang's interests. Just like Putin, Kim too wants to erase the armistice line, the line that separates both the Koreas. He also has revisionist tendencies like his idol Vladimir Putin. The outgoing South Korean president Moon Jae-in was at the forefront, along with Donald Trump, the former US president, in trying to reach out to Kim Jong-un and engage him in a dialogue. That dialogue process, it went on for a few years but did not reach any conclusion. If anything, that dialogue only seems to have further emboldened Kim Jong-un. But the reason why countries like Japan and South Korea are spooked is because Putin's actions seem to have challenged their fundamental concept of self-defense. Now remember, both Japan and South Korea are treaty allies of the United States, but they are not full members of NATO. And that is a bit similar to the position that Ukraine finds itself. Ukraine too is not a full NATO ally, and therefore NATO is not bound by Chapter 5, whereby an attack on one is an attack on all. Therefore, NATO is not bound to attack Russia because it has attacked Ukraine. So if the United States and its allies are not putting boots on the ground to defend Ukraine, then the question that many are asking in Tokyo as well as in Seoul is that what is the guarantee that the United States will defend Japan or South Korea in the event that China were to invade either of these two countries? After all, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are not exactly happy about America doing all the heavy lifting on behalf of NATO. In fact, according to John Bolton, who used to be Donald Trump's former national security advisor, if Trump were to come back for a second term, and it looks possible that he could in 2024, he's free to run again when America goes to polls, and there's a good chance he might even win, then Mr. Bolton is convinced that NATO will be dismantled, that Trump will dismantle NATO, which also means that countries like Japan and South Korea will simply have to look out for their own interests and for their own security. Clearly, the world is a much more dangerous place today than it was a month ago. And in the face of this new challenge, Japan and South Korea need to reconsider their idea of security. Sending virtuous signals of peace will not be a replacement for a hard power strategy. They need to look out for their own interests because America, their biggest ally, their biggest supporter, may not always be up for the job.